The whole nightmare started the day I bought my house, a modest two-story place on a quiet cul-de-sac that had always been outside of the strict HOA boundaries that controlled most of the neighborhood, which was precisely why I chose it in the first place. I had no interest in paying some committee of self-important busybodies to tell me what color my door could be or whether I could park my truck in my own driveway, and I thought I was clever enough to avoid that trap until Karen showed up. A middle-aged woman with the type of haircut that practically screams, "Let me speak to your manager," armed with a clipboard, a fake smile, and the audacity of someone who had been running her little empire unchecked for years. She marched right up to my front porch the week after I moved in, introducing herself as the president of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, even though my deed explicitly excluded my property from it, and she handed me a thick packet of documents with highlighted sections telling me I had 30 days to sign and agree to the rules, fees, and covenants that all responsible homeowners in the community followed. But when I flipped through the paperwork and told her politely that my house wasn't included in the HOA and I had no intention of joining, her smile vanished like a curtain dropping on a stage, replaced by a sharp sneer and a cold stare that made it clear she wasn't used to hearing the word no. Over the following weeks, Karen became an uninvited fixture in my life, dropping off reminders in my mailbox, tapping on my window to lecture me about leaving my trash cans outside for more than an hour, even though the city ordinance allowed 24 hours, and gossiping with my other neighbors about how I was a troublemaker, threatening the neighborhood standards. But I brushed it off because I knew I was legally in the right, and frankly, I didn't think someone would go as far as to sue me over something so absurd. Yet Karen proved me wrong when I came home one Friday to find a certified letter taped to my door with the bold letters "Notice of Legal Action" stamped across the top, and inside was a lawsuit claiming I was in violation of HOA rules by refusing to comply with mandatory membership, something that didn't even exist in reality. But she filed it anyway, attaching pages of bylaws, random signatures, and a laughable attempt at a covenant that had never been recorded with the county. I spent that whole night reading every word, my anger boiling with every ridiculous claim, from failure to maintain property appearance because my grass was an inch taller than her standards, to unauthorized vehicle storage because my truck was visible from the street, and then the ultimate claim: refusal to pay required HOA dues, even though no contract or legal mechanism tied me to her organization. It was so absurd it would have been funny if it wasn't such a blatant abuse of power, and I realized then that Karen wasn't just trying to push me around, she was trying to make an example of me, to scare me into compliance so that nobody else in the neighborhood dared to resist her little fiefdom. And the more I thought about it, the more determined I became that not only was I not going to give in, I was going to fight back with everything I had, because if she could do this to me, she could do it to anyone, and I wasn't about to let her win. I started by pulling out my closing documents, flipping to the property description, and highlighting the clause that explicitly stated this property is not and shall not be subject to the covenants, restrictions, or obligations of the neighborhood name Homeowners Association. And then I dug deeper, heading online to the county recorder's office and pulling up every HOA filing Karen had ever submitted, only to find that half of them weren't even properly filed, dates didn't match, and in some cases, there weren't enough signatures to legally enforce amendments, which meant that for years she had been ruling the neighborhood with nothing but intimidation and the hope that nobody would challenge her. I spent the entire weekend building a binder of evidence, organizing every false claim she made, every improper filing, every legal loophole she ignored, and by Monday morning I was sitting in front of a real estate attorney who took one look at my documentation and broke into a grin, telling me that not only did I have nothing to worry about, but I had a real shot at dismantling the HOA altogether if I wanted to push back hard enough. And that was the moment the anger I felt turned into something sharper, a cold determination to not just defend myself, but to shut Karen down completely, because bullies like her thrive on fear and compliance, and the only way to stop them is to hit them with the one thing they can't manipulate, the law. So when I walked out of that office, binder in hand, I wasn't just preparing to defend my property, I was preparing to wage war against Karen and her fake empire. And in that moment, I knew she had no idea what kind of storm she had unleashed. When the court date was set, Karen must have thought she already had it in the bag because she strutted into the preliminary hearing like she owned the place, dragging along a cheap lawyer who looked like he had been hired off Craigslist the night before, and she kept shooting me smug little glances, as if expecting me to crumble under the pressure. But what she didn't realize was that I had spent the last 2 weeks arming myself with enough evidence to not only dismantle her entire case, but to expose her HOA for the fraudulent scam it really was. When the judge asked for opening remarks, Karen's lawyer launched into this pompous speech about protecting the integrity of the community and how my refusal to participate in the established system was an affront to every responsible homeowner, which might have sounded compelling if not for the fact that he had no legal foundation to stand on. And when it was my turn, I calmly handed the judge my binder, flipped to the page that contained the clause in my deed explicitly exempting me from HOA covenants, and said, "Your Honor, not only am I not legally obligated to join the HOA, but this organization has been operating without proper filings or authority for years." And the room fell dead silent as the judge leaned forward to examine the documents. Karen's smug expression melted in real time, her lips twitching as she tried to whisper instructions to her lawyer, who was now furiously flipping through his own thin folder, realizing he had been blindsided. And that's when I made my next move by pointing out that several of the HOA amendments Karen had cited in her lawsuit were not properly recorded with the county, some even missing notarized signatures which rendered them legally invalid, and I could see the judge's eyebrow raise higher with every page I presented by the time I reached the section showing that Karen had been collecting mandatory dues from homeowners for years without any enforceable authority, essentially running an unregistered business that pocketed thousands of dollars annually. The judge looked absolutely done with her nonsense, and he finally turned to her lawyer and asked, "Do you have any evidence contradicting this?" To which the man stammered and muttered something about community expectations and historical precedent, but the judge cut him off with a sharp, "That's not law, counsel." And I swear I almost smiled right there in the courtroom because I knew the tide had completely turned. Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up, and she leapt to her feet, trying to address the judge directly, waving her arms and ranting about how if people like me refused to follow the rules, the neighborhood would descend into chaos with junky cars, overgrown lawns, and unsightly decorations. But the judge silenced her with a bang of the gavel, reminding her that she wasn't the one on the stand, and ordered her to sit down, which she did reluctantly, her face turning the color of a ripe tomato. When the judge dismissed the claims against me with prejudice, meaning she couldn't file the same nonsense again, I thought that might finally be the end of it. But instead, the judge turned to me and asked if I intended to pursue any counterclaims, and that's when I felt the full weight of the opportunity in front of me, because not only had Karen failed to rope me into her HOA, but I now had the chance to bring her entire fraudulent operation crashing down. So I stood, cleared my throat, and said, "Yes, Your Honor, I'd like to file for a motion of declaratory judgment to invalidate the HOA on the grounds of improper filing, lack of authority, and fraudulent collection of dues." And the look on Karen's face in that moment was priceless, like someone had just told her the police were coming to confiscate her crown jewels, and her lawyer sputtered, protesting that I couldn't possibly take such drastic action. But the judge nodded, acknowledging that my evidence made a strong preliminary case, and scheduled a hearing for later that week. Suddenly, the 3-day countdown to the end of Karen's reign had begun, and I spent every waking hour preparing for it, gathering testimonies from neighbors who had been bullied into paying dues, digging through county records to highlight every single irregularity in the HOA's so-called governance, and even photographing the ridiculous violations Karen had issued over the years, like one man being fined for having a holiday wreath on his door in February, or another being told to remove his daughter's swing set because it wasn't aesthetically consistent. By the time I returned to court for the follow-up hearing, I had a mountain of evidence stacked so high that even the bailiff raised an eyebrow when I wheeled in the cart, and when I began presenting it, one page after another, showing that Karen had lied, manipulated, and effectively extorted money from her neighbors under the guise of an HOA that didn't even legally exist in its current form. The judge's patience wore thinner and thinner until he finally declared that not only was Karen's lawsuit dismissed, But the HOA itself was dissolved effective immediately pending county review, which meant that in less than 72 hours, Karen had gone from trying to drag me into her fake empire to watching it crumble into dust before her eyes. And the best part was that I had done it all legally, using nothing but facts, documents, and the very system she thought she could manipulate to crush me. As I walked out of the courthouse, free and vindicated, Karen was left in the hallway screaming at her lawyer, demanding to know why he hadn't fixed it, while my neighbors, some of whom had been too afraid to confront her for years, began to approach me quietly, thanking me for standing up to her and asking how I had managed to pull it off. And all I could say was, I just read the fine print. The days following the court's ruling were nothing short of surreal, because in the span of 3 days, Karen had gone from being the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, barking orders and handing out fines like a tyrant in a crown made of printer paper, to being the subject of whispered gossip, open ridicule, and outright hostility from the very people she had lorded over for years. And the change in atmosphere was almost instant, like someone had flipped a switch and suddenly everyone felt free again. Neighbors who used to scurry back into their houses when Karen walked down the street now lingered on their porches, laughing together and trading stories about all the absurd violations she had tried to enforce, from demanding one man remove his flagpole because it was too tall to ordering another family to repaint their front door 3 different times because none of the colors met community standards. And as these stories spilled out, it became clear just how deeply Karen's petty dictatorship had infected daily life, leaving people paranoid and resentful. But now, with the HOA legally dissolved, it was like a weight had lifted, and the relief was almost palpable. I remember standing on my lawn that first weekend after the ruling, mowing my grass at my own pace, when a couple I had barely spoken to before came over with a six-pack of beer and thanked me profusely, telling me how Karen had threatened to sue them once for parking their RV in their own driveway for a week, and soon after that, more neighbors trickled over, each with their own horror story, until it felt like a neighborhood block party was forming right there in my yard, laughter ringing out louder than I had ever heard it in this supposedly quiet community, and all of it fueled by the collective joy of seeing Karen dethroned. Meanwhile, Karen herself was unraveling in spectacular fashion, storming from house to house with her infamous clipboard, demanding that people voluntarily continue following the HOA rules, even though she no longer had any authority to enforce them, and most folks either ignored her entirely or shut their doors in her face, while a few brave souls actually laughed at her outright, which only made her more unhinged. One afternoon, I caught sight of her standing at the end of the street yelling at a group of kids because they had drawn chalk art on the sidewalk, insisting it was graffiti and threatening to call the police. And when one of the kids' parents came out and told her she had no power anymore, Karen shrieked something about standards and stomped off in a rage, muttering loudly about how the neighborhood was going to rot without her leadership, and it would have been sad if it weren't so ridiculous. As the days stretched on, her behavior only grew more erratic. She started taping homemade violation notices to people's doors, written in red marker on loose leaf paper, and leaving voicemails filled with rambling threats about future consequences if people didn't mow their lawns to her standards, until finally someone reported her to the local police for harassment, and an officer actually showed up at her house to warn her that if she kept stalking her neighbors, there would be real consequences. And the irony of Karen, who had weaponized rules and authority against everyone else, now being told she was the one out of line, was delicious. At the same time, the collapse of the HOA revealed just how much money she had siphoned out of the community, because once the judge declared it invalid, some of the more meticulous neighbors started digging through their canceled checks and records, calculating just how much they had paid over the years, and when they added it up, the total easily crested into the tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds, depending on how long they had been stuck under her thumb, and there were whispers about a potential class action lawsuit to recover the funds. Though most people seemed more interested in just moving forward and enjoying their newfound freedom, but the damage to Karen's reputation was permanent, and every time she tried to regain a shred of control, she only embarrassed herself further. I'll never forget one particular moment a week after the ruling when she showed up at my driveway while I was washing my truck, glaring at me with pure venom in her eyes, and she hissed, You don't understand what you've done. You've ruined this neighborhood. To which I calmly replied, No, Karen, I just stopped you from ruining it. And she stood there trembling with rage before storming off, slamming her clipboard against her leg as if it were a weapon. But the truth was she no longer had any power, and everyone knew it. The irony was that without her constant harassment, the neighborhood didn't fall into chaos the way she predicted. In fact, it got better because people started taking pride in their homes not out of fear, but because they wanted to. Kids played outside without being told their bikes violated aesthetic consistency. Families put up decorations for holidays without worrying about fines, and the overall sense of community blossomed for the first time since I moved in. It was amazing to watch this transformation from a place ruled by fear to one defined by freedom, and every time I saw Karen sulking on her porch, glaring at everyone like a deposed monarch watching peasants celebrate, I couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and pity, because she had built her identity around controlling others, and now that she couldn't, she was nothing more than a bitter woman with a useless clipboard, screaming into the void while the world moved on without her. Looking back on everything that happened in those 3 chaotic days and the weeks that followed, I realized that what started as a personal battle to protect my own rights ended up reshaping the entire neighborhood in ways I never could have predicted, because by standing up to Karen and refusing to be bullied into her illegitimate HOA, I didn't just save myself from years of pointless fees and arbitrary rules. I ended up exposing a rotten system that had thrived for too long on fear, misinformation, and one woman's hunger for control, and the ripple effects of dismantling it were astonishing. Over time, people who had once lived in quiet resentment found their voices. Neighbors who barely spoke to one another before began forming genuine connections, and there was this unspoken but powerful sense of solidarity that grew out of our shared liberation, almost like we had survived a dictatorship together, and were now free to build something better. Some of the families who had been especially victimized by Karen's antics took things a step further, organizing casual meetups and cookouts, encouraging everyone to get involved not because of some mandatory community covenant, but because they genuinely wanted to, and what emerged was a neighborhood that finally felt alive, colorful, and authentic, free from the suffocating grip of rules that dictated the color of your blinds or how many garden gnomes were acceptable on a lawn. As for Karen, her downfall was both dramatic and pathetic, a slow-motion collapse that played out for everyone to see. After the court dissolved the HOA, she tried in vain to re-establish authority by forming an informal council, but nobody joined, and when she realized she couldn't control people with paperwork anymore, she resorted to shouting matches, angry Facebook rants, and endless threats that carried no weight, until she eventually became something of a pariah, avoided by nearly everyone, her phone calls unanswered, her flyers tossed straight into the trash, and though she continued to linger like a storm cloud, it was clear she was powerless. Rumors circulated that some neighbors were preparing to sue her personally for the years of dues she had collected under false pretenses, and while I never learned if those lawsuits ever went through, I do know that the county opened an inquiry into her financial handling of HOA funds, and the last I heard, she was scrambling to provide receipts and justify expenses that didn't add up, which, given her sloppy record keeping, must have been a nightmare for her. On a personal level, I learned something invaluable through all of this: that bullies, no matter how intimidating they seem, almost always crumble when confronted with facts, persistence, and the law, and that most people comply with unjust authority not because they agree with it, but because they're too afraid or too exhausted to fight back, which is exactly what someone like Karen counts on, and that knowledge has changed how I view every aspect of life, making me more willing to question, to challenge, and to stand firm when I know I'm in the right. Neighbors still joke about me being the guy who killed the HOA, and while I laugh along, there's a deeper satisfaction in knowing that I didn't just shut down Karen's little empire. I also proved that one person really can make a difference when they refuse to be pushed around. I still remember the exact moment the judge declared the HOA dissolved. It felt like a curtain lifting, sunlight flooding a stage that had been dark for too long, and I don't think I'll ever forget that sense of vindication, that certainty that justice had been done, not just for me, but for everyone who had been quietly suffering under Karen's rule. Sometimes I catch glimpses of her on her porch, still clutching her clipboard like a lifeline, her eyes following the kids on their bikes, or the neighbors putting up Halloween decorations in September, her mouth twisting into a frown as if she still can't believe her kingdom is gone. And part of me almost feels sorry for her because she built her entire identity around controlling others, and when that was stripped away, she was left with nothing but her bitterness. But then I remember the stress, the harassment, the lawsuit, and the countless people she bullied, and that sympathy evaporates, replaced by a quiet pride in knowing that by refusing to be her latest victim, I helped free an entire street from her grip. Now, whenever I sit on my porch and watch the neighborhood buzzing with life, kids laughing, neighbors chatting, families grilling, I can't help but smile because this is what community should look like: free, spontaneous, and rooted in choice, not fear. And it all began with a single word I refused to back down from: no.